look, it's becoming more and more because people are really understanding and having clients who are, who are really pushing for it. I mean, the demand is becoming greater. So governments need to get involved more in really trying to support those who are pushing sustainability and building resilience and all of those things, because it's such an important issue. But it's bringing up the whole industry, I think, is going to be really challenging, even though it's globally, I think we do fall short in our codes in keeping up with what's being done. But unfortunately, it just takes more people being a bit louder about it, and and then seeing like the completed projects, and who doesn't want to not have energy bill, like electricity and gas bills, and live in a home that's healthy to live in.
Deemed to perform, you work with your clients, as you said, from a consultancy sort of point of view, and you're creating performance solutions. So what does it mean? Like, what does a performance solution look like? How will someone know that they need one? How do they need to get themselves up? What do they need to anticipate in terms of the whole process of going about that performance solution?
Yeah, sure. So I guess it's initially knowing when a performance solution may come up is part of understanding how the code operates. So generally most projects you start from the deemed to satisfy. So the deemed to satisfy it's essentially the checkbook or the recipe book of most standard domestic construction. And if you meet those provisions, then you're deemed to have complied with those mandatory provisions, the performance provisions. Now, ideally, this would be if you're going to vary outside of those deemed to satisfy, that's a trigger point for a performance solution. So ideally, if you don't have a consultant building surveyor who's doing preliminary checks for you, you have a designer who understands that element of the code and goes, hey, yeah, look, we're going to have to do a performance solution for this one because we're varying something from that very quite restrictive set of parameters within the code. There is another trigger that I think is probably quite misunderstood by design practitioners as well, is if the code is silent and it doesn't have a deemed to satisfy provision, you automatically, because you still need to demonstrate compliance, and this is for matters that are generally regulated within construction, you have to do a performance solution. There's no other way around it, because you don't have that deemed to satisfy option to follow, so you need to do a performance solution. So they're the main trigger points. It's most of the time it comes up as a result of varying from a deemed to satisfy and then silence. So there are some scenarios like pool drainage. So if you're doing a pool, you will always need a performance solution because there are no deemed to satisfy ways of demonstrating compliance for pool drainage. So all pools for drainage, you need a performance solution, and the code has deliberately been silent on that particular matter. So that's just one example of it. But in most cases, it'll be, you're varying from that prescribed set of requirements. So ideally, flagging it early on. What happens more often than not is you go through the design, get what you want, you submit it to your statutory building surveyor certifier. They come back with a 2-3 page checklist of things that they want to see more information, things that don't comply, and that's where they'll flag that, hey, you need a performance solution. So that's where it can be, it's not the ideal time to pick it up, but that is most likely the time that most applicants will see that they need a performance solution.
Okay. And so these performance solutions and that checklist that you talk about, these are on individual things, aren't they? So can we just go through perhaps some examples? Because I think some people might hear this and think, okay, well, I'm either going to go a total deemed to satisfy route, or I'm going to go a performance solution route and I'm just going to get one report. But it doesn't necessarily work like that, does it? So
No.
how does, and I can hear people going, well, I'm just actually going to game the system and I'm going to learn what all the deemed to satisfy clauses are, and I'm only going to stick to those because that's going to make it the simplest pathway through. That's not necessarily possible either, because you talk about those things that that projects that the code is silent on.
Yeah.
So can you share some examples of performance solutions that you've been working with clients, particularly in custom residential renovations and new builds, so that people can start to understand and see where this might sort of step into their project?
Yeah, so I think it's important that most projects will be a combination of deemed to satisfy and performance. We often, like I said before, we often start with deemed to satisfy, understand those. And look, some people will go about their projects and do, you know, predominantly deemed to satisfy. You know, if they don't have a pool, or if they're using deemed to satisfy cladding systems, then they can, you know, possibly do their whole project as deemed to satisfy. The concern or the issues that sometimes come up is you don't get the best use out of your site by doing that. You'll get a design outcome that maybe isn't working for you, whereas a performance solution offers you that flexibility to get the best out of your site and still have a compliant design. So it's a two-stage process. It's much more heavily regulated than it ever was in the past. Has to be done by someone who's not your relevant building, so your statutory certifier building surveyor. And you've got the first stage, which is a briefing stage, and that sets out, well, what it is that you want to achieve, what performance provisions you have to adhere to. So it's an element of design. I'm yet to come across a building that is fully performance solution. You know, generally, you know, you go with the deemed to satisfy starting point, and then certain elements of design you do performance. So which of the performance provisions are applicable? Who are the stakeholders involved? So engineers, owners, designers, the relevant building surveyor, just as an authority, as a stakeholder as well. And how it is that you're going to demonstrate to your building surveyor that what you're proposing complies with the performance solution. So you have to have a set of acceptance criteria and a methodology. So that's the first stage. It's a brief, it's a methodology, it's how are we going to do it? Not after it's already done. This is supposed to, I highlight the word supposed to, happen before all of it happens. And then once all the stakeholders have reviewed that, happy with it, then they sign, you know, they acknowledge that they're happy with it. And then you go to that next stage, which is really the detailed technical revisions, supporting information. If you've got any calculations, you know, verification methods that you're using, you then incorporate that into the report. So there are a couple of things also just to flag on that. In some circumstances, the statutory building surveyor may require a certification from whoever prepared that performance solution. So in Victoria, we call it a Building Regulation 126 Certificate of Compliance, and there's only certain practitioners who can do that. So building surveyors and engineers, those type of designers can't provide them. There's actually prescribed people who do that. So just bear that in mind when you are preparing, you know, if you are going through a performance solution, that it's not a mandatory requirement for it to be certified, but some building surveyors may request that. So the practitioner that you've got preparing it, you just need to be mindful. Again, I don't know about the other states, how that all fits in, but in Victoria, it's an avenue that you just need to be mindful of. Also, there are some performance solutions, particularly with fire engineering matters as well, that they're regulated as to who can prepare that and who's an expert in that field. So yeah, look, depending on the matter and then who's preparing it, how it gets prepared, and how it may be accepted on the other end from the statutory building surveyor, just some important hold points when you're making that decision around performance. So a couple of, going through some domestic projects, probably the most common performance solutions that I see is varying the step down that you need to have from your slab. So if you've got a slab going to an impermeable surface, so, you know, like landscaping, you need to have 150 mil step down from the finished floor level to the external surface. Or if it's a paved surface, you need 50 millimetres. Often your site parameters don't always allow you to do that to get the design that you want. So varying whether it's an absence of step down or actually building below ground level, very common. Flush al frescoes, they're always very, you know, when you want to step out onto your al fresco, you don't often want to have a step down by 50 mils. So doing a flush system there, which, you know, often incorporates a drainage system at the opening, some hobs to lift your cladding and your timber framework off the slab, very common. And probably the other more common performance solution that I would see is for extensions. If you're on a house that has stumps, so you've got a subfloor system, and then you go and do an extension that's on a slab, you've cut off a lot of the cross-flow ventilation to that existing dwelling. So setting out a performance solution to make sure that you're not going to have issues with rising damp with that original house and the subfloor there. So depending on the extent, you may increase the amount of natural ventilation available to the subfloor, or do a mechanical inline system there so that you've got continued air changeover in that system, because the prescribed requirements for subfloor ventilation is that you require all sides need to have openings. There's required distances so that you're getting sufficient cross flow. So the moment you've cut off one side, then you need to look at going for performance.
Wow, gotcha. Okay. I've seen conversations in architectural Facebook groups about just what people are finding comes through as performance solutions, and it can be different kinds of flooring. You mentioned the cladding as well as different kinds of things. So like I want to ask a little bit more about that, but first, just so people understand how much time this takes. So you mentioned the performance design brief and
Yep.
getting together all the stakeholders, the statutory surveyor obviously also saying what they're expecting to see from it,
Yep.
and that all being laid out. You're figuring out as the consultative surveyor what needs to be inputted into it and who needs to be involved, and sort of setting out that method, which I can see from a risk management point of view, long term makes sense. Like it's that thing of, whenever you see a result, you don't necessarily understand what has been all the motivation and driving factors to come up with that result. So it can be easy to disagree with it. Whereas, and it can come down to just a matter of interpretation and opinion. Whereas when you get to see that performance design brief, see the thinking and understand it in a lot more detailed way, like I can see why that actually is a really handy tool to have in the process. So you do that, and then you obviously then follow that up with any additional information that's required, as you mentioned, be it technical details, data, that kind of stuff. What kind of time frame is that sort of taking everybody to kind of, like, when somebody hits this in their project, how long are they having to wait to sort of then get over the hurdle of getting this performance solution sorted to keep moving?
Look, it really depends on the complexity of it. So if it's something, to do with cladding, a lot of products are code-like certified, so that takes a lot of the time frame out of it, because it's a tested material, it has a degree of certification. These more stock standard ones where you're using construction methodologies that are generally accepted, it's not too much of a blowout on project times. Look, you might 3 to 4 weeks possibly to get, when you're plugging in, design, if you've got a designer who understands it too, and look, they often will say, yeah, well, look, we don't have a step down, we're going to incorporate a hob at this point and we're going to do this. So that tends to move quite quickly. It's where you're possibly using materials that are quite a bit out of the ordinary that may push out, or you need to get structural engineer, quite a bit more structural engineering, or if you're varying anything to do with your plumbing, they're the ones that tend to, the more stakeholders, the more inputs. And what's really important about that briefing process is making sure that, because buildings are systems, you don't want to just, even though the performance solution is for a certain part, if you just focused on that part, there can be domino effects for the rest of the building. So having a good project team and who can see that, and you've got your engineer involved and say, hey, that's not going to work, so that you can keep dealing with that building as a system, because you don't want to isolate parts of the system and have impacts on other parts. So it's a really useful point. And you don't want to be reverse engineering things, which is often how performance solutions in the past used to come out, like something's happened on site and and then you have to reverse engineer it, whereas this is a really deliberate act of, no, this is what's going to work for our site and this is why. So the time frames, look, unless you're doing something really pushing the boundaries, or something that maybe your relevant building surveyor or certifier isn't overly familiar with, because it is, will take some extra time for review. It's the time frame, I don't think would be for most parties a real showstopper in getting for most standard domestic projects. And really it's that weighing up of how important is it to me in doing this for the design. For a bit, a few extra weeks on, the approvals process or the design process, and there may be additional costs too, but is that what I need for my dream home at the end? Is that the end result, rather than trying to cut corners on that and get the end result being something that you're just not going to be happy with? So it's just weighing up, and always with performance and deemed to satisfy, it's, if you're quite budget conscious too, look, going the more deemed to satisfy route may be more appropriate for you. Whereas if your budget is a little bit bigger and you can, test the boundaries in other ways and get something that, is really what it is, your dream home, and what it is you want, then it's a case of weighing out what your priorities are and what your values and what's important to the project.
Gotcha. Well, I think like you've highlighted some stuff there in terms of, I think, homeowners thinking about how they navigate this for their project. And, you mentioned right up front the value of getting the consultative surveyor in during the design phase. And you can see, as you start to talk about these things and you unpack the fact that it's not a whole of project thing. It is literally that you will find that every project is a combination of deemed to satisfy and performance solutions. And it's really about how much, I think some sites will, as you said, to maximize the opportunities that the site has to create the home that you want, or if you're working with a particularly challenging house that you're extending and renovating, performance solution will just be necessary in order to optimize the outcome. And then in other projects, it might be because you're particularly attached to a specific functionality outcome, or a design outcome, or an aesthetic outcome, or a material or product, or that kind of thing. So how do you recommend, like, I think of homeowners trying to budget for this and trying to kind of program time, and schedule and think about the overall scope of the project and who they need to have on their team and how all that works. How do you sort of recommend homeowners think about this in terms of the ongoing conversations that they're having with their designer? Is it that just, okay, we just need to budget for a consultative surveyor right from the outset, and we need to know that that's going to be a team member, and when we're developing design concepts, we're just going to push them across their desk as well, so that we can get this advice on an ongoing basis? Or is there, other ways where their designer can be providing advice about, well, this may be performance, in our experience, this has been performance, we could do this and it's deemed to satisfy. So they're juggling sort of what that might mean, so that when they have to get the performance solution done down the track at the approval phase, they've got budget allowed for the consultation fees at that point. What are your how are you saying, you're working with people and at best working?
Look, it really depends on the complexity of the project. Obviously, it's more straightforward. The smaller the project, the more likely it is that designer can manage most of that. A lot of it comes down to engaging a designer, I think, because the designers are there from the start. And I think engaging a designer who can provide a degree of project management, and someone who really not just understands great design, but also understands the codes and how they operate, they're going to be the key. If you've got a simple project, getting a consultant building surveyor may not be appropriate, or unless you're doing something quite innovative, even though it's a small project, quite innovative, may not be appropriate for your budget. So having that designer who, when you discuss with them, I guess gauging, word of mouth is always, I find, the best way of finding good consultants. So if you've got a designer who really understands the codes, they'll be like, hey, you're not getting your step downs, or hey, we're doing this. Then at that point, early in the prelim design, their red flags are up as to where it's going to be. Then get your consultant building surveyor involved to work through a performance solution. So I think having a really good design practitioner involved early on, and I think they're generally the ones who are best placed to do a degree of project management, to raise those red flags, point you in the right direction. They often understand the terminology, but to give, I think, the homeowners just having that knowledge prior to is really important, just to say, okay, I know generally, what it is and how we're dealing with this and what it means to have a performance solution. It's just catching really, it comes down to the complexity of the build, and if you are doing something that's, a large new home, you are planning on doing things a little bit differently from energy efficiency, materials, whatever it is. I think getting a consultant, even if they're just doing the prelim assessment to high level to say, hey, this is going to be an issue, this is going to be an issue, then you can make some decisions with your designer early on.
Fantastic. Can I ask you a question that's a bit left of field, but I
Sure.
think it might illustrate some things that are helpful for people. So I find a lot of the Undercover Architect community, they're wanting to pursue more sustainable homes. That can mean that they're using materials that aren't code marked or aren't sort of necessarily tested because they might be from smaller operators who haven't had the funds to go through the code mark process, or they're newer products and materials that are, and they're early adopters of those products. I was obviously introduced to you by Hamish White at Sanctum Homes because he said you were super helpful on the hempcrete house, which he's been on the podcast and talked about previously. And so, for those homeowners that are pursuing those sustainable outcomes or even passive house outcomes, and the new National Construction Code, for example, from what I understand, it obviously is now requiring vapor permeable membranes or pliable building membranes of particular classes in particular climate zones. But the ventilated cavity is the thing that then triggers the verification method because it's not deemed to satisfy, as far as I'm aware, in terms of that. How are you seeing people who are chasing high performance buildings and those kinds of materials like the hempcrete having to navigate this, and what tips do you have for people that might be over and above what we've already talked about in terms of understanding what they're potentially going to need to set themselves up to understand as they navigate their project journey?
Yeah, look, it's a big one. I think going into the project, understanding that, because of our code really is not keeping up with what's happening in the industry and what from a construction, because there's obviously varying factors for setting a minimum level that you need to bear in mind. And I don't think the prescribed requirements are keeping up with a lot of the technologies and ways that people want to pursue sustainable buildings. So it's not a straightforward process, and it's not always an easy one. And a lot of it too is sometimes on the statutory building surveyors end, in maybe not being exposed to a lot of the systems that are being proposed. So I think having a design team that's experienced in each of those matters, and I think the consulting building surveyor plays an important role in those types of projects, because there's going to be various factors that are going to require performance solutions, and liaising and advocating with your authority to be able to get to that next level, because we just don't have in the code structures in place that really deal with those high performance buildings and the kind of systems that are required in order to get there. And that has a lot to do with building materials. I think building materials are probably the biggest one. If they're not code mark certified, it really makes it quite difficult, and you may need to get specialists involved when you're dealing with facades and roofing systems. So, from a structural engineering point of view, manufacturers, there's a whole host of potentially additional people that you need to get involved with. So I think, if you're really dedicated to really going quite far past the minimum requirements with sustainability, you do need to be prepared for longer turnaround times, more costs from a design and consulting point of view as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I'm just grateful that the people who are pursuing high performance homes, both from a professional point of view and a personal point of view, are generally very, very passionate about it. And so they're willing to kind of step into the fray of what it's going to take. But it is so hard. I do feel like I feel like these building codes, we have been dragging this ball and chain with us, those that are working on custom projects where people are wanting to improve what they do, are seeing what's happening overseas, are understanding that Australia's climate isn't that different to lots of other locations, are wanting to build homes that are more suitable to support our health and our well-being, and that are durable and that, can sustain themselves across the climatic regions and extremes that we have. And it's literally like, this base minimum of the building codes, which is then satisfying sort of this other part of the industry, is being is being dragged, and even to the point where these changes have been delayed aid and all of that kind of stuff. Like we are really a long way behind many other parts of the world. And there's so many
Massively.
people desperately trying to help us avoid, leaky building syndrome and the problems that we've got evidence of in other locations with similar climates to ours. And so it's really, I'm very grateful for those, both in the profession and homeowners who are tackling this for the first time, that just stay true to the course of what they want to do and decide what their values are and really persevere and pull the right team together to make it happen.
Absolutely. I give massive kudos to those who venture on those projects, because I know how difficult, and it's such an important, building resilience, climate, all of that. They're massive issues, and we're just like, even this shift from 6-star to 7-star whole of home has been such a massive, like, just to try and get people to adopt it, when on the global scale, somewhere like Melbourne in Victoria, we have a relatively mild climate, and to get our buildings performing better, like, it's not in the sort of the predominant industry forefront. And look, it's becoming more and more, because people are really understanding and having clients who are who are really pushing for it. I mean, the demand is becoming greater, so governments need to get involved more in really trying to support those who are pushing sustainability and building resilience and all of those things, because it's such an important issue. But it's bringing up the whole industry, I think, is going to be really challenging, even though it's globally, I think we do fall short in our codes in keeping up with what's being done. But unfortunately, it just takes more people being a bit louder about it, and and then seeing like the completed projects. And who doesn't want to not have energy bill, like electricity and gas bills, and live in a home that's healthy to live in? Like, it's all these really like common sense things that when you put it that way, oh yeah, no, that is really nice and really good.
And isn't falling apart in 10 years after you spent several hundred thousands of dollars on it. Yeah.
Right. Or you're really suffering in, relatively minor fluctuations in temperature. It's getting there, but yeah, it's look at those in the industry who are doing it. We're becoming a little bit more quite a tight-knit community too, and pushing out and just chatting to people about it and getting involved with those projects. It's getting there.
Yeah. And I think this is the thing, is that people view these codes as almost like a hammer on the head of like, you must do this, and it feels like this oppressive kind of regulatory thing. But this has come about because the construction industry can be like the Wild West in certain sectors, and it can
that's
be
exactly right.
We've seen so many, we've seen fatalities from issues around how buildings have been put together. And we've seen lots of financial damage to people's individual, personal finances in terms of buildings not performing the way that they need to. And so the government's using all it kind of has is at its fingertips at the moment, which are these regulatory codes, to try and compel, it knows that like we've seen evidence of the fact that people don't do things just because there are lots of parts of the industry that won't do things just because they can and it feels better.
Right.
They actually have to do it. They have to be put into a position where it's required for compliance. And so it's a very blunt tool and a very blunt weapon against, sort of creating to help us create better homes. But it is the tool that we've got. And I think that from a risk management point of view, I can see why those regulations are shifting the way that they are. And as you say, like most of the people I'm talking to, it's like, it's in the right direction. It's still not enough. It's still bare minimum, but we can see that there's hope on the horizon in terms of, how it's sort of moving ahead. So now, before we wrap up, I'd love for you just to, you've touched on it a couple of times as we've been talking, but to help homeowners understand how they find the right people to work with, that are going to understand this and be able to kind of shepherd them through quite a complex process, particularly when they might have a complex project as well. What do you recommend they should look for, they should ask about, the certifications, licenses, those kinds of things, to really make sure that they're getting the right team around them from this point of view?
Yeah, that's a starting point's always, I think, word of mouth. If you know people, getting involved with online forums who have dealt with project teams, that generally, if it's gone smoothly, it's a good indicator of a good project team, certain individuals. So I think as a starting point, word of mouth referrals are always a good point. Then certainly you need to look at qualifications and registrations with certain state authorities as to what's required, and then their experience. I mean, you need to work with a team that is in line with your ethos and values and what it is you want to achieve in the project. So if it's budget, you need to find, a designer, design team who are quite conscious of budget, or if it's energy efficiency or sustainability, people who have experience in those areas. And a lot of it comes down to having a discussion with them around it and really understanding what their their ethos as designers are and whether it aligns with what you're trying to achieve. So that's, you always have to look, obviously what's on paper, but I think also so many projects are so complex and there's so many elements, and everyone's priorities are different. So I think establishing that and finding people who are in line with that, and someone who looks at design holistically. You can't go, and this applies to structural engineers, it applies to architects, it applies to builders as well. A building is not parts, it's a whole, it works as a system. So designers who understand that, and that applies to if you do get performance solutions, someone who understands that, and they're not going to give you something that's just looking at one part, but then you've got domino effects in other parts of the building. And something people don't like to talk about is insurance too. So performance solutions, making sure whoever you get involved to do your performance solutions, that they're appropriately insured for doing that, because aside from those real specialist areas like fire safety and engineering, there's not a lot of strict requirements around who can prepare a performance solution. So just be mindful of, if you've got a designer or architect preparing it for you, that they're sufficiently insured to be able to do that, and they've done it before, because there's obviously a complex web of regulatory things that you need to navigate in addition to the technical requirements, and that you're not going to get to submitting that to your building surveyor, your statutory certifier, and it gets knocked back because no one wants that. So yeah, just a few things. And I think a lot of it comes out of just having some frank discussions about prior experience, values around how people deal with projects. And often designers will have engineers that they work quite closely with, so they tend to have a good web of people around them that work well with them and share those values. And, if they continue to work with it, often it means that projects are running quite well. So yeah, that's probably the best indicator. If smooth project experience, and then I think getting that team early on is probably the best way to initially handle it.
Are you seeing architects and designers being the ones that are going to prepare these performance solutions, or are more of them bringing in a consultative surveyor or certifier as part of it?
More and more are bringing in consultants because of the additional requirements, especially now with the introduction of the brief, and building surveyors the statutory building surveyors are requesting it too, because of the requirement for the knowledge in regulation, various parts of the building code, actually understanding performance provisions as well. So I think maybe in the past designers have had a bigger role in preparing it, but it's become a much more stringently regulated matter for good reasons, in that if you're doing something that's maybe not as tested as something we're deemed to satisfy. So deemed to satisfy is, not that it's not best practice by any means, it's minimum. And I think that's a really clear point to make, is you can have a performance solution that is a much better solution than going deemed to satisfy by far. But I think, and so you're doing something that's potentially more innovative, untested, you need to have someone who understands the landscape there. So so that's why it's more stringently regulated. That briefing process mimics what fire engineers do. They have a brief process. So getting that structure, it's something that certainly has gone more in the hands of consultants for good reason.
Yeah, I would think from a risk management point of view on the part of the architect or the designer, it makes sense to have a consultant do it as well, because it's like when you submit a town planning application, to have a town planner who actually understands how to write the language in accordance with the planning legislation is much more straightforward and much better for a risk management point of view. The same thing with this process. I think somebody who then knows how to actually identify all the clauses and write in the similar language and understand how to kind of navigate those processes through. It's a lot for an architect or a designer to take on, I would think. So,
and it's another person involved that understands the system. So it's not just a case of, checking boxes to get it past the, the certifier. It's really a case of building surveyors have different, and, other building consultants have different strengths to the designers, and working together, you really just get a much better picture over what it is and how to deal with that particular matter, rather than just leaving it to a single individual. So yeah, certainly from a risk management from an approvals point of view, but also actually getting the best outcome to having another design with a different skill set is really important.
Fantastic. Now, we've covered a lot. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about, or that you want to mention before we finish up?
We could talk for hours about this. No, look, I think from my point of view, I think we've hit most of it on the head. It's just, I think, understanding the structure of compliance and how the BCA operates is really just your first port of call of understanding whether it's something that you need to do.
Fantastic. Laura, thank you so much. It's just been so great. We've really dived into the detail, and I know that this content's going to be super helpful for those listening. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge and your wisdom. We'll pop all of the links to Find Deemed to Perform in the resources. It's been really great to have you here and lovely to spend this time with you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.